And today's webinar is a continuation of our Empowering Tomorrow webinar series focused on transmission. Energy demand is surging across the country as America brings manufacturing back to the United States, builds data centers necessary to sustain a 21st century economy, and leads technological advances made possible by artificial intelligence. This increased demand makes transmission reform and grid modernization crucial to American ingenuity, economic development, and, as we'll discuss today, national security. Building transmission lines is a lengthy and complex process. Like other major infrastructure projects, transmission lines can face delays that are measured not in months or in years, but in decades. Last year, the United States added only 251 miles of high voltage transmission lines, a number that's been declining for a decade. And unfortunately, our investment in our power grid pales in comparison to our economic and geopolitical rival China, which invested 5 times more in its power grid than the United States in 2022. Historically, transmission policy has been bipartisan, with conservatives leading reforms in the early 2000s and shaping many provisions found in the Energy Policy Act of 2005. And even in the heat of this year's presidential election cycle, with all its twists and turns, we're starting to see that bipartisanship come back again, with the Energy Permitting Reform Act working its way through the Senate. But it's going to require all of us to overcome today's hyper-partisan dynamics if we are to build the transmission capacity that our nation desperately needs. Without a focus on permitting reform and transmission modernization, it will be impossible to get electrons from energy projects to consumers, grow our economy, and achieve and sustain American energy independence. The increasing demand for energy will cause a stress on our grid and further exacerbate blackouts. America simply cannot afford to be held hostage by an aging power grid. As we'll discuss on our conversation today, America is a powerhouse that invents breakthrough technologies, puts food on the table, and builds for the future every single day. The American power grid powers America's exceptionalism. It's not hyperbole to say that America's power depends on our grid security. So if I can end my remarks with a brief commercial, I'd invite you to visit www.americanpowerhouse.org, which is an initiative of CEN, to learn more about why America's power grid is absolutely critical to our nation's success. Now, nobody came on here today to hear me drone on. So without further ado, please allow me to briefly introduce our panelists before we jump into our conversation. Jonathan Monken is a principal at Converge Strategies, where he specializes in energy resilience, strategy development for electric utilities, military installation, large commercial energy consumers, and community critical infrastructure. He designs energy resilience program and planning resources for federal and state government agencies, Fortune 100 companies, and electric utilities. Jonathan is a graduate of West Point and served in the United States Army for 21 years before joining Converge Strategies. He was the Senior Director of System Resilience at PJM Interconnection, which is the largest grid operator in North America. There, he developed new resilience strategies to integrate transmission planning, system operations, physical and cybersecurity, and energy markets. Danielle Russo is the Executive Director of the Center for Grid Security. She's an innovative leader and policy expert focused on aligning energy programs and policy with national interest. She has worked extensively on transmission expansion for national security and overall grid security and resilience planning. She has spent 4 years as a senior analyst and policy writer supporting the Office of the Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Energy Resilience and Optimization, where she focused on policy development and decision-making for enhancing military installation energy resilience. While she worked there, she worked extensively on various efforts, including energy resilience exercises, energy project planning tools, government partnerships, defense critical electric infrastructure, and more. Her previous experience also includes supporting energy security programs for the U.S. Marine Corps, Army, and Army Reserve. And in 2020, Danielle won a Federal Energy and Water Management Award for her work supporting exercises at military installations. She holds a Bachelor of Science in Environmental Science and Technology from the University of Maryland. As an Ohio State grad, it's good to have another Big Ten voice on the call today. And last but certainly not least, Jade Gillespie is a Houston, Texas native with diverse experience in public service and government affairs, focusing on energy and environmental policy. In her current role with our affiliate in Texas, the Conservative Texans for Energy Innovation, she regularly demonstrates her expertise in reviewing policy changes, cultivating relationships with stakeholders, and advocating for clean energy policies rooted in conservative principles. Previously, Jade has served as a constituent liaison for a member of the Texas congressional delegation where she employed her extensive knowledge of federal agencies to resolve constituent needs ranging from delayed veterans claims to helping Americans stranded abroad. She has worked as a team with other members of the congressional staff within Central Texas to serve more than 1 million Texans. Jade's also worked as a district coordinator for the Texas House of Representatives and as a transportation manager while serving in the United States Air Force. Jade has previously completed the prestigious Atlantic Council Veterans Advanced Energy Fellowship, and she holds a Bachelor of Arts degree in political science with a minor in public relations from Texas Tech University. So thank you to the three of you for joining us for this conversation, and looking forward to getting our conversation started. And Jonathan, I'm going to turn to you with our first question here. Converge Strategies released a report earlier this year entitled Transmission Expansion for National Defense Trend, we'd love to hear a little bit more about what prompted this report. Can you give us a brief summary of what Trend entails and what it aims to do?
Yeah, absolutely. I think what we saw was kind of a cognitive gap just in terms of the broader understanding of the role that transmission plays from a national security perspective and a literal support of Department of Defense installations. So a lot of the conversations up until this point and previous to the trend report really focused on very, very tactical level energy resilience. So if there's a building that makes a mission go from a DoD perspective, then we need to put a backup generator on it to make sure that it doesn't fail. Or if the grid is not there to support it, that it has its own means of doing so. And then there was a heavy emphasis on programs like utility privatization, where you're taking the day-to-day operations of that local distribution grid on a base and putting it in the hands of a private utility provider so that they can do some necessary upgrades of local infrastructure. I think what we saw, though, is recognizing that when you have a different set of circumstances related to the way in which energy assurance risk shows up for the Department of Defense, that was central to the theme of Trend, which is recognizing three things specifically. One is an open recognition of the fact that energy assurance risk to defense missions happens at a regional level. So yes, there are circumstances when individual bases lose their electricity service. What's really important from a mission standpoint is when you have a circumstance that multiple bases have this kind of common failure at a bulk electric system level at the transmission scale, recognizing that you could lose 5, 6, 7 different installations that all share kind of the same dependency on transmission infrastructure. The second part is recognizing that the energy systems supporting the Department of Defense are an extension of the weapon systems platform itself. So it's not just there's an F-35 and the F-35 does its thing and the grid just happens to be there. It's an open recognition of the fact that the electricity grid is really an extension of that platform. It's necessary to make sure that all the different pieces of that mission are available to support the warfighter really at the end of the day. The last piece is recognizing that defense communities that surround defense installations are part of the mission capability of the installation. Because conventional wisdom within the Department of Defense for years was focusing inside the fence line of DoD and trying to bolster those systems. But now there needs to be a growing recognition of you really need to zoom out from the defense perspective and recognize that 65% of your personnel live outside of the fence line. 100% of your civilian personnel that support DoD live outside of the fence line, and all these other infrastructure systems they depend on would not see benefit from energy resilient solutions that are limited to inside the fence line. So those are the main themes, but it was really trying to address that gap in terms of our collective understanding of the ways in which the grid can support national defense missions at scale.
That's awesome. Thank you, Jonathan. I know we're going to dig into that a little bit more as our conversation goes on. Danielle, would love to turn to you, and I don't want to speak for SAFE, but I think that you all would probably agree with a lot of the recommendations that are in that trend report. Could you give us a little bit of information about your organization, the work that you do, and how that all works together to help advance transmission modernization?
Yes, absolutely agree with the messages in the trend report and support, all the work that's done because it's been published. But yeah, I'd be happy to talk a little bit more about SAFE. So SAFE is an action-oriented think tank, nonprofit foundation that's focused on accelerating the deployment of secure, resilient, sustainable domestic energy that supports American economic and national security. And we do that by bringing together prominent military and business leaders to help develop and advocate for policy that's focused mostly on reducing our dependence on foreign sources of energy, mostly liquid fuels. And, the work that we do in transmission is really based on the fact that through our policy work and our education work, we saw that the grid really was more of a choke point than an enabler for the things that we need and want to do as a country in support of our economic and national security. And looking into that more, how do we change that? And the answer very clearly was transmission expansion. So that's really the center of that work for us and why it's become a growing focus at Safe Center for Grid Security.
Awesome. Thank you so much for that. And Jade, I know that you're a Houston, Texas native. We were just in Houston for the National Conservative Energy Summit. Texas has obviously felt the importance of reliability when it comes to your power supply over the past few years, as you've dealt with Winter Storm Uri, several different tropical storms that have come through. How has that impacted CTI's work and the work of folks curious about energy policy in terms of educating policymakers and the general public on the importance of having a reliable power grid?
Sure. So it goes a little further than beyond even weather and inclement weather that we've had. We've also had a very significant population boom in the past 10 years. And unfortunately, when people move to Texas, they're not bringing electricity, power, or transmission with them. So that has really highlighted the focus of what CTEI, Conservative Texans for Energy Innovation's mission is. Throughout a legislative session or an interim session, it's advocacy with both policymakers and the public in general, just to demonstrate that we really need a variety of energy resources. We need a reliable power grid. We need one that is responsive to demand. We also need to be at the forefront of innovation. Governor Abbott once said that Texas moves at the speed of business, and I feel like the market definitely indicates that as well. And so all these pieces go into the role of what CTEI is doing on the ground day to day. And sometimes it's working with rural county officials to work on a big development, and then it's also engaging with policymakers, stakeholders, and constituents alike.
Awesome. Thanks, Jade. And actually, I saw a kind of a point of similarity there, I think, between your answer and what Danielle was talking about the grid being a choke point and not an enabler. And Jade, you talked about how as we bring in, whether it's economic development or as we're considering the effect on military installations, or Jonathan, as you were talking about, how do we focus on the larger defense communities? And I grew up not too far from Wright Pat Air Force Base and in Dayton, Ohio, and so I'm really familiar with defense communities, and I think that's bringing us to the point that at the end of the day, everything runs on power and having access to secure and reliable energy. And as we become more and more advanced, whether that's with our military capabilities or with economic considerations, which help position the United States as a geopolitical power, we need to make sure that we're moving at the speed of business, that we're not having that choke point there, as was mentioned. So really appreciate that insight there. And Jonathan, I think this kind of parlays into my next question for you. In your report, you brought up the concept of deterrence by resilience. Could you dive into that for us in a little bit more detail? How does the national security imperative really intersect with American energy security overall?
It's a great question, because fundamentally it kind of follows the principle of, why do you put a security system sign in your front yard, even if you don't have one? Which is, they'll just go to the next house. Why go through the risk of potentially running into something that could prevent you from successfully executing your attack? And I think what we're starting to see now is, certainly if we look at the war between Ukraine and Russia, energy systems are being actively targeted. And there's a reason for that. It certainly has impacts on military capabilities directly, because of that dependency that I mentioned before about weapon systems relying on access to reliable and resilient energy resources. It certainly has impacts on really just the overall impact to the general population. So recognizing that if you can disrupt power systems, it has significant, profound effects on the general population. But I think in the most literal sense that we should take it, deterrence through resilience really gives us the opportunity to say the grid is not a viable target for enemies to think about when they want to stop the United States from achieving some geopolitical or military objective. And so in the absence of taking the proactive steps to bolster the system and communicate that, it should not be subtle. We should be very direct and open about the fact that we're making substantial investments in energy security to make sure that it's just off the table. We'll never be able to bring risk down to zero. Every Army officer has to go through constant risk assessment processes, no matter what activity you're doing. So we can't bring risk to zero, but what we can do is signal through strategic and substantial investment in energy systems, whether it's hardening existing systems that we have, building out added redundancy, adding more domestic energy resources so that we don't have those kind of dependencies on international resources. All of these things provide a very, very clear signal to our adversaries around the world that we're making the investments necessary, that the grid just isn't a viable target anymore. It's not going to stop us from doing what we need to do from a force readiness standpoint, from a force projection standpoint. And right now, I think the risk that we're running in not making those investments is the exact opposite. If we can't signal that type of resilience on our energy systems, it will remain a viable option. It'll be the soft underbelly that we don't want to have for the Department of Defense. So I think it just kind of highlights the importance of it's raised in the global consciousness right now as a military means of accomplishing these types of objectives, this active targeting, whether it's cyber or physical, of these energy systems. And instead, we should demonstrate that it's not going to work because we've taken proactive steps necessary to mitigate.
Yeah, no, that's wonderful. Thank you for that, Jonathan. I was thinking as you were talking, it's reminded me of Teddy Roosevelt, right? Speak softly but carry a big stick, and maybe the 21st century equivalent of that is speak softly but have big wires. I don't know, something along that line.
But 2024, Tyler, you got
it. And I think you're exactly right. Right, the world looks to our actions. All you have to do is turn on the news. Currently, we have the UN in New York City. We have plenty of geopolitical situations around the world, and folks still do look to the United States to see what signals we're sending, to see how we're leading. So really appreciate your perspective there. Jade, here at home with reliability issues in Texas, how have military installations in the state been impacted? Obviously, I know BRAC is the four-letter word that no one ever wants to mention, but it's a really serious consideration that the DoD looks at, right? What's your access to energy look like? How reliable is it? It's a really serious thing. In your view, have some of these reliability issues left either the American national security in a more vulnerable state, or the Texas economy in a more vulnerable state, recognizing how vital military installations are to so many local economies?
I really like this question. This question is very exciting to answer. So recent reliability demands and weather has had some impacts on our installations across the Lone Star State. There's a big need for more vigilance with data being an electronic piece versus a paper file as if it used to be. And so the demand for energy on our installations in Texas are only going to continue to grow. The vulnerability, though, really underscores the need for energy independence and to keep our installations competitive, secure, reliably powered at all times. I think it's really impressive how the DoD has really taken in innovative energy solutions. So I saw that earlier this year, Fort Cavazos, formerly Fort Hood, is getting a microgrid on it. There's several installations that have geothermal hot rock technology available for behind the meter use. While I worked for the representative in Congress, we worked diligently on phantom solar. So all these pieces really help to keep our military limber, on their toes, ready to respond to a national security need, a global security need, but while maintaining that integrity in Texas. I think one of the more important things to focus on is strengthening the transmission capabilities. So that way, power can get throughout the installations as they need. And beyond those installations, some of our installations can be in some pretty rural spots along the Texas map. So it's really important to see that influence. But no, I think the demands that the challenges of our recent weather and just all the needs that we're having with all these new energy technologies and data centers and how we're transmitting information is so important. But no, I think it's made America stronger in a national security position because it's demanding innovation. It's demanding responses to energy.
Yeah, no, Jay, thanks for that. I really, really appreciate that. And it's great to lead us into the next question of there is that demand for innovation. There is a demand for us to figure this out, right? As I said at the beginning, we have power demand that's growing for the first time. And we're starting to come to some bipartisan solutions here, or at least putting proposals out that I think are going to lead us towards those solutions. And Danielle would love to just ask you, what impact do you see recent developments, whether it's NEPA reform that's sort of percolating in the House. I know there was a hearing a week ago, I believe it was last week, led by Mr. Westerman from Arkansas, or the Manchin-Barrasso Energy Permitting Reform Act, or Order 1920, which came out from FERC earlier this year. How do you see recent developments like that? What impact are they having on our ability to build out the power grid and to achieve this idea of deterrence by resilience?
Yeah, I mean, all of the items you mentioned have huge potential to impact the way that we build out the grid that meets our national interests because they're all sort of national policy and requirements, right? Which have really been lacking in the grid space for a long time. We really have a grid that's made, at the state level and the regional level, which is important in a lot of ways. But to achieve these more national goals or solve these more national problems, we need national policy. So, when you see things specifically like Order 1920, right, that introduces coordination requirements, long-term planning requirements, that's really important because often the things we're talking about here, sort of the electrification of defense and growth in advanced technologies in the United States, the onshoring of critical industry, those are long-term goals that require planning and coordination across the board. So, you know, it's a very hopeful and exciting time with a lot of these rules and policies coming out, not all officially signed yet. But the fact that we're talking about it is really, really wonderful. And even in saying that, I want to be clear, we haven't seen a policy yet, at least not from SAFE's perspective, that fully closes the gap in the way that it needs to be. We really need a clear integration of the energy needs of defense and of economic security, mostly in the growth of advanced technologies and onshoring of critical supply chains to be explicitly mentioned in these policies, right? What we see now is a mention of national interests that refers to rates and reliability, which is, again, a critical first step that has a lot of potential to have a wonderful impact. But it should be seen as something that lays the foundation for more robust policy that helps get us to where we need to be.
Yeah, and panelists, I apologize. I'm going to deviate from our run of show here, as is the moderator's prerogative, because, and I'll use this as an opportunity to remind folks, you can submit a Q&A for us to answer at the end of this, using the button at the bottom of your screen there. But Danielle, I was writing down one of my own questions, and instead of waiting until the end, I want to ask it now. With some of these developments that are coming out, would love for folks their take on where should federal policy end and state policy begin to sort of take that baton. And maybe a second part of that question is, what can states be doing to help ensure that we do have more of a national energy strategy when it comes to our grid?
Quite the question. I could
Sorry.
go for it first if everyone's okay.
Sure.
Yeah, that's like the $1 million question, right? I think that generally it's the role of federal policy to ensure federal goals are met, and not political goals, right? Like national goals.
Sure.
Like we're able to achieve our national defense priorities, not just that's a really hard thing for a state to take ownership of and accomplish. But at the same time, we don't believe national policy should impose even specific types of technology preferences or other types of goals on a state. So that would be my perspective. I know that's pretty vague, but that would be the starting point and the basis of it for me. And I would just flow out details from there, right? So things like deterrence by resilience, like John mentioned, or economic security imperatives like onshoring critical supply chains for whether it be batteries or certain types of metal refining that we have determined we're too reliant on others for. That's where federal policy should step in and work with states to make the grid capable, something like that. So that would be my position.
Yeah, I
No, and
think
Danielle, go ahead, Jonathan.
I was going to say, building off of that, I think the transmission question specifically is why this is so relevant. So I think what we've seen is that up until now, the approach has been very localized within states and looking at the utility level and how they're providing service to defense installations specifically. I think we're starting to see that shift a little bit more where there are plenty of states like Texas that have more than a dozen defense installations. And so doing it one at a time is not really compatible with the type of risk mitigation that we need to approach this question with. And so when you get to the state scale and understanding there needs to be more connective tissue between how states are approaching it and what federal policy can do as kind of top cover of sorts, recognizing that there are enabling mechanisms, whether they're economic, they're policy related, they're regulatory related, of just saying there needs to be more top cover there so that states have more flexibility in how they ultimately approach this. And we recognize the grid that we're working with is regional in nature, right? It's interconnection level, it's multiple states. And so if we don't recognize the policy parallels to the physical grid systems that need to support these types of things, it can't be an either or. Like, well, we'll just fix it one installation at a time or even one state at a time. And it also can't be, well, federal policy is the only thing that needs to be fixed. In order for this to work, it has to be the combination of the two. And so I think that shows up in the way that there could be better coordination between federal organizations like the Department of Defense and FERC, as an example, where there's really not a formal program that allows them to communicate freely about what are DoD's needs in this space and how could policy or regulation being shaped by FERC have positive or negative effects on what DoD's requirements really are or how they're impacted by it. Same thing is true with programs that Danielle knows very well, like defense critical electric infrastructure and the Department of Energy. If there's billions of dollars in federal money available for infrastructure investment, how do we use programs like that as a targeting mechanism for priority investments in grid infrastructure? So there's a there. The challenge right now is I think there's kind of blurred boundaries about what state strategy looks like and utility strategy looks like and how that can be supported and coordinated at a federal level with those types of policy objectives.
Thanks, Jonathan. Really, really appreciate that, and I think that makes sense. And Danielle, I particularly appreciate what you said about sometimes the federal government needs to take the lead when it's not about a political agenda, but it's about something that's in our national interest, of which transmission certainly falls squarely in there. And there are some things that states can do. They can help streamline their regulatory environment so that we can build when it comes time to build. And you've already gone through processes like NEPA. We can and should be working to educate policymakers, whether they're in an RTO or not, about A, the value that the grid brings them, and B, the power that interconnection brings the state and how that enhances reliability for not just military installations, but for all end use consumers in a state. I think too often we take for granted in this country, and it's a blessing, but we take for granted that, all right, the lights are going to flip on when I want them on. They're going to flip off when I want them off. And my AC is going to kick on when we want it to kick on. And sometimes that can lead us to complacency. And so it's on us, I think, as folks who are in the advocacy world to make sure that policymakers and decision makers are being educated on this. Jonathan, going to you, going back on schedule here. Sorry for derailing us for a moment, but can you discuss the importance of grid modernization to ensuring that our military installations and critical infrastructure remain operational during emergencies?
Yeah, I think the biggest thing to focus on right now when it comes to grid modernization, in my mind, is the result of two things that we need to keep our eye on. One is the fact that the resilience that we're seeking to achieve is not going to happen inevitably. We have to be very intentional, very deliberate about the ways in which grid modernization directly supports resilience. That in and of itself is going to be really, really challenging. And the primary reason why is we don't have the necessary market mechanisms or standards and requirements for resilience that we can strive for. So it's great to say, like, we want a resilient system, but there is no commonly accepted standard for resilience by design. So if we say we need to build a system that's capable of doing the following things, we need to understand what those really requirements and objectives are for that grid system, which is important because I think to this discussion on national security, DoD at least has the ability to communicate what their requirements are that fit that criteria of saying it needs to be energy, yes, but it also needs to be energy that meets the following needs. So they have goals set forth for themselves as an example of 6 nines of reliability for installations that house national defense missions or critical defense missions by 2032. That's a huge goal. 6 nines of reliability. There's not a utility in the country right now that can say, yeah, no problem, we can give you 6 nines of reliability. The second piece of it is recognizing that along with grid modernization, you have to tackle all of the electrification and load growth that's happening right now across multiple sectors. You can't treat that in isolation. So the techniques or tactics of grid modernization need to be compatible with both the requirements of the Department of Defense and others that require energy resilience, like defense industrial based companies. And you have to marry that up with what we're seeing in trends related to load growth, just comparatively speaking, exponential load growth compared to what we've seen in the last 25 years. So that will not happen by accident. So if it's not part of a very, very deliberate and well-structured approach to how we tackle grid modernization, it's not going to happen on its own. So that's where we really need to be much more focused on this transmission component of recognizing that it helps with load growth significantly. And not only does it help, but it's essential. You really can't handle that level of load growth without it. And the second piece is transmission plays a very, very important role in that modernization component of resilience, of saying in order to get there, we have to have the systems available to support it.
No, right. And Jade, I know Texas has experienced, you said this earlier, Texas has experienced just exponential load growth, right? As people are moving in, as you have a state economy that's moving at the speed of business, and at the end of the day, it's really new data centers, it's new manufacturing facilities, it's the adoption of AI that are really driving that load growth, and something you have Tesla located in your state, right? That's a large manufacturer, but they're doing a lot of really cool things that are going to just put more demand on energy. What are some of the economic implications in Texas of investing in domestic energy production? And obviously, if we're investing in energy production, we've got to get that power somewhere, right? So we have to invest in the grid. Do you see this as a way that can help reduce the U.S.'s dependency on foreign energy sources? Do you think there's a path to American energy independence out there?
Oh, goodness, absolutely. By investing in domestic energy production and grid modernization, it's offering Texas a substantial wealth of economic benefits, job creation, innovative thinking, as we saw at the National Conservative Energy Summit, solar recycling, wind blade recycling, all of these industries didn't exist really until recently. And with the demand here in Texas, in the business favorable market that we have here. By modernizing the grid and expanding both renewable energy resources and our traditional resources that we've always had, oil and gas, it just will keep Texas at the tip of the spear when it comes as a national leader in energy innovation. The strategy would also reduce will also reduce the reliance on foreign energy sources, encourage more exports than imports. It'll just continue to let the United States and Texas lead in that market space. I think it's really important to mention that Texas is quite the powerhouse of energy production. Apparently, we make the most crude. We surpass wind. We've led the nation in wind for almost 20 years. I'm pretty sure we've surpassed California in solar, and we're also the largest energy consumer. And so it's really interesting to see the need for the market to respond to the ask of our DoD, our data centers, our innovative businesses, our AI technologies. And so I think it's really placed Texas in a position to lead the country, and also to make America completely energy independent. I think that's absolutely going to be something that comes to fruition in our lifetime, and I'm looking forward to seeing that.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Jade. And yeah, Texas is just an energy powerhouse. Folks should listen to our podcast, the Conservative Energy Podcast. We're dropping a new episode, I believe, sometime today on Apple, Spotify, wherever you get your podcast. I will give you the answer to our trivia question on there. It's what power source accounts for over a quarter of Texas's power, and it's wind. And wind development started under Governor George W. Bush, and it continued under Governor Rick Perry, and it's continued under Governor Abbott. Just sort of this attitude of really going for all of the above and not saying no to any one energy source. So obviously, a lot of lessons to be learned in Texas. And Danielle, when it comes to the issue of modernizing our national energy strategy, something I know we talked about a little bit earlier, can you discuss the importance of educating policymakers and the general public throughout that process? Has SAFE found as a productive way to engage in that kind of education?
Yeah, educating policymakers and really just the general education about this topic is such a powerful tool. At SAFE, we do education work, and we also do some lobbying work, which I don't really participate in, but have seen. And I really believe that the education piece is maybe more powerful than lobbying itself even, which you might not think is the case, but it really allows you to change someone's perspective in the long term, right? Not just sort of convince them to agree to a certain provision or bill or something like that. So, and I think your previous question to me, a lot of the policy we're seeing now is the result of a lot of hard work and education by a number of organizations on how important grid modernization is to achieving our national interests. And what we found to be really effective is to just first connect with people on what they care about, right? Which is often not the grid, because that connection isn't always there. But I think, no matter what it is they're trying to achieve as a policymaker, I'll talk about that specifically. I was just talking to someone from the Department of Transportation the other day who's running a really innovative program there. And they're saying everyone I'm trying to work with is coming to me and saying the grid is their problem. And I'm not really sure what they mean by that, So it's the basis of everything that's important to us. It really is. So it's not hard to draw that line once you start to understand what someone's trying to achieve and educate them on what they're going to need from the grid to achieve it. So we really back out from it that way instead of sort of coming in about the grid and maybe some of the scarier statistics. We just don't find those to be as motivating, honestly, for people to integrate some things into policy that need to be integrated. So I would just say our approach is always to understand what are people's priorities, what do they care about, whether it's making sure there's power where they go to work every day, making sure there is in fact a factory in their town to work at, and it doesn't go away because of energy prices or reliability issues, or making sure that the military installation they live by functions and is resilient and serves the community, and then kind of saying, okay, if that's what you want, this is what the grid's going to need to do to get you there. So that's how we approach it and what we found to be really effective.
No, that's awesome. And Danielle, I like the strategy of let's be productive. Let's not create a doom and gloom, and you need to create that urgency sometimes, but let's find a way to address these really serious problems in a manner that adults would. Awesome. Well, a rapid fire here to kind of wrap up this portion. And again, I want to remind folks, utilize the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen here. We all agree clearly that the power grid needs to be modernized, and that's really important for our national security. In your mind, what should the priority be for what should our nation's top priority for federal planning and investment be in our power grid? And anybody can jump in.
Yeah, my first instinct is we've had a couple of rounds now of some of the most significant pieces of legislation for energy investment ever, and transmission was not included in either of them. So I think where we find ourselves right now is there just has to be a priority that's placed on this area of investment for the grid. There's been a lot of other ways in which we've addressed things like supply chain vulnerabilities, onshoring manufacturing capabilities, making sure that infrastructure is the priority that it should be. And so right now, I think the missing piece is out there, and whether it's pieces of legislation that I know Danielle's familiar with, like the Energy Permitting Reform Act of 2024, and where that potentially goes from here. If you haven't read our op-ed, you definitely should, and Utility Dive. If you look at things like FERC Order 1920 and what that means for long-term and interregional planning, which is hugely important, these are just pieces of a much bigger puzzle, and there needs to be more of a coordinated effort, especially as we talk about the national security issue, because national security almost never, if at all, shows up in these policy conversations, which to me is a huge miss, right? It has to be not just part, but an essential part of the conversations that happen at a federal level about where we go right now from a grid investment standpoint, from a grid policy standpoint. And I think part of it is just because that linkage is not well enough understood or articulated so that policymakers and elected officials feel comfortable bringing that into the dialogue. It feels too broad. It's just too existential. It's like, well, everybody should care about national security. And you're like, yes, we definitely should. But making more of those literal connections between how this policy can have this positive effect also kind of brings home the local component of this, which is often missing, of understanding, well, okay, well, I don't want to see a transmission tower built, and trying to have a new understanding or appreciation for the ways in which that type of infrastructure investment has a very literal benefit to a defense community like the one you grew up near, Tyler, of saying, okay, well, it's not just a good idea to go ahead and do this from an economic perspective. It has profound implications for national security in the United States because of the presence of these defense installations that need this energy.
I really appreciate that. Thanks, Jonathan. Danielle, Jade.
Go ahead, Jade.
You go.
I would really echo what John said. The biggest thing would be an explicit integration of national security into energy policy. And like John said, not in this existential way where it's like a term in the policy, but like truly working with the national security experts and leaders in the country to integrate their energy needs into grid planning and policy. And what that's going to, the answer to that, I would bet a lot on, is going to be expediting transmission expansion. So if it was, a priority in terms of a specific infrastructure investment, I would say transmission expansion, because like Jade mentioned, and Texas is a great example of this, we have abundant energy resources in the United States, and we could tap into those fully. But if we can't effectively and resiliently move it throughout the country, not much change is going to happen. So that would be response.
And to second what both of my colleague panelists have said, no, it's enhancing that grid resilience through advanced technologies as well. Utilizing the innovative thinking of Americans is what will bring changes to the future that we desperately need. So I think that's really important. And I agree with utilizing our subject matter experts. Let's use these experts and hear them out and really take to heart what they're suggesting to us. You know, they didn't become an expert in their field because they made a lot of wrong decisions, right? So I'm with both of my panelists on this.
Yeah, no, thank you all. And also just want to toss out the question before moving into some audience Q&A. You know, what effects do you see the November election, however they shake out, right? We'll see. However they shake out on having America, or what effects do you see on the election having on America's long-term transmission strategy? Can we make this something that remains a priority regardless of which party controls the White House or the Speaker's gavel? Would love your thoughts there.
Yeah, I mean, elections have consequences. It's the shortest way to say it, right? So no matter what, I think what's helpful about the national security topic is I have yet to hear anybody involved in the election from a candidacy standpoint that says, I don't care about national security. And so it really, two things that I feel like parties very much have in common is national security, we're very supportive, and we love infrastructure. So the good news is we're talking about a bridge issue. We're talking about something that has really uniform support. And so what's important is really transitioning that from an idealistic support to a very tangible support from a legislative standpoint, and being proactive about the ways in which we can kind of take that from a general sense of I'm supportive of national security and bring it to much more specific terms. So when we talk about the ways in which legislation is used or not used to be able to support these particular outcomes, it's making sure that the tools and capabilities that the Department of Defense needs are well articulated in pieces of legislation like the National Defense Authorization Act, so that it's a very literal representation in the enabling capability for the department from a funding standpoint. But then also that there's a unity of effort within the federal government. And I think those are the types of things that can be brought forward in the discussion to say there are many different roles and responsibilities and authorities within kind of the broader reach of the federal government. They just need to be coordinated in a more literal fashion. So there's no doubt that November will have impacts on where we go from here. But if we can establish that these are points of commonality between candidates, between parties, and between advocates, great. Let's put it out there in a way that shows measurable forward progress.
Thanks, Jonathan. Any other thoughts before moving on to our next question?
Yeah, I would say the goals I've heard, voiced by both campaigns, whether they be the reduction of energy costs and the growth of American industry on US soil, or a complete, clean energy transition, are not possible without transmission expansion. It's not even to say they would be hard, right? They will not be possible without it. So I think if those here, working on these issues, continue to be willing to have bipartisan conversations with either both campaigns or both, sides of the aisle in terms of policymakers, and make that really clear, we can feel good about the impact of the election on transmission expansion and our long-term plan for that as a country, no matter what the outcome, right? So it will require continued work and education, but unless one of the candidates is willing to not achieve their goals, I would say that they should hopefully continue to have their eye on the prize when it comes to transmission expansion. I guess you could say that's more of my hope than an actual reality, but that's my response.
No, I really appreciate it. Thanks, Danielle. Jade?
Second, what Danielle said, I think it's the advocacy and education piece is so important throughout this. Because yes, we do have a really big election at the top of the ticket, but I also think all the way down to the last person that you're going to vote for on your ballot is also really important. At least in an ERCOT perspective, what really, sometimes our state lawmakers are really influential on where do we go from here, if you will, and what's coming next. And so it's it's really important that us in the advocacy space just continue to focus in on our messaging. We're doing a great job at who we talk to and who we outreach to. And I think just a new election brings new faces to a legislative session. And it's just a new opportunity to kind of grow our network, to grow what our mission is, to educate, advocate, and really just remind people that it's not necessarily about what made the energy, what's the resource that made it, but it's how are we getting it to the people that need it the most. And so I think that's also a big part of this. So I'm looking forward to the election being over. And I think all of us are. But it's really great things are on the horizon, regardless of the outcome, at least in the space that we're in.
Yeah, no, thanks, Shade. And that's a great reminder. There are just really important decision makers, whether they're your state representative, your governor, even down to county commissioner and township trustee when it comes to actually siting the towers and getting the steel in the ground that we need for this build out. So PSA, fill out your ballot all the way down. Don't just stop at the top of the ticket. Awesome. Well, next question here, Danielle. I know you talked about this or touched on it just briefly. You talked about that none of the policies that are currently out there, right? Whether it's NEPA reform in the House, whether it's energy permitting reform act in the Senate, neither are kind of the be all end all, right? So, would love to just ask the panelists, what does that ideal policy? What's missing that should be included in some policy action? I know that's a big question. Lots of options to go there, but
the first thing that's missing is, what we see in these policies a lot, which is really wonderful, is like a structure for determining the benefits of a project in order to prioritize it for permitting or what have you, or sort of like a list of desirable traits or things a project delivers to kind of expedite its construction or integration into the grid. And those are often like different manifestations of reliability that are in those lists of benefits, which again is like essential first step, really wonderful. But I think we could go so much further. We could get so much more specific about some of these bigger things we're dealing with as in like nationwide, right? Whether it's like certain elements of industry we're specifically trying to onshore. We know their energy needs, right? So let's make that something we're looking for in a project and then prioritize projects that get us there. Same thing with, John mentioned several times the requirements that the DoD has. Those are known requirements, so let's integrate those requirements into the prioritization of projects that serve the grid and put that into our policy. So those projects happen first, and they can be transmission or generation, what have you, but that would be the first thing on my list personally.
No, I appreciate it. And Jonathan, I see you're typing an answer to it, and I'm going to switch. Thank you, Danielle. I'm going to switch just briefly. We have another question here. In cases like New England, the New England Quebec interconnection and energy sale to help power Massachusetts, in your opinions, is it a good thing to be buying power from an allied nation and having that capability, or is it better to be completely 100% self-reliant? Would love any thoughts that the panel might have.
Yeah, I'll spoil the surprise. So it's easier to say than it is to type. But my approach would be it's really an option of both forms of resilience or a benefit. So instead of making it binary where you can do one or the other, I think what we need to understand is certainly a strategic ally like Canada that we share an air defense space with very literally. So we have joint national defense missions with Canada. We need to be able to support one another just like we do on the battlefield. We need to do the same thing from an energy standpoint. So I think there's significant value in it. Also, Hydro-Quebec and Canadian energy is highly flexible because of the amount of hydroelectric power that they provide specifically in New England. So I think there's unique performance characteristics of hydro that is extremely useful to what we would need. But the second part is that should not absolve us of the responsibility of making sure that we have domestically produced energy resources that are supporting that. So it really, I think this is one of the biggest challenges we run into is the false choice of you have to have one or the other and you can't have both. I think the approach really needs to be an eye towards the ways in which redundancy supports resilience. And so they are not exactly the same term, but they are mutually supporting. And so I think there just needs to be a growing appreciation for the level of interregional transfer and interconnectedness that transmission provides as an example, and the relative benefits of having domestically produced energy that can continue to support that. So I wouldn't even treat that answer as a cop out because we need to be able to do both. Because if we can't, not the one solution is not going to work everywhere. There are areas of our system that are not currently interconnected to the degree that that would be able to accomplish our outcomes. Just like we can't produce all forms of energy everywhere in the United States, even though DoD is located in all 50 states. So those are the kind of things that we really need to be able to tackle.
No, that's great. Thank you for that nuance there, Jonathan. I think that's something that's really important. Glad we were able to highlight that. I know we're coming up at the top of the hour and the end of our call, and wanted to just ask the panelists any final parting thoughts, or if not, happy to wrap up here a minute or two early. All right. Well, I'm going to take that silence as my cue to do the little end here. Really want to thank everyone for coming to today's webinar, and thank you to our three great panelists for their participation this morning. I really hope that you found the conversation interesting and informative. It's certainly a really important and really timely conversation. Please be sure to be on the lookout for our next webinar in our Empowering Tomorrow webinar series. It will be next month in October. It'll be centered on community engagement and stakeholder collaboration in transmission projects. So very much looking forward to that. A recording of today's webinar will be made available to all attendees. You can learn more about CEN by visiting www.conservativeenergynetwork.org. Really appreciate everybody again for your time this morning, and hope everyone has a great rest of their day. Thank you all so much.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.